Good evening, everyone. We're in Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to look at verses 5 to 9 tonight mainly. Brady did a good job of getting us through the first part of the chapter, and especially I kind of felt like I was echoing. And is that better? Can you hear me now? Yes, I was. I had my mic off on purpose. I was trying to keep you humble, especially since you're sitting way back there. Yeah. No, he did a good job getting that covered. So we're going to move on from that to this idea of masters and servants, and then we're going to get to the armor of God eventually in this chapter, and I think we have plenty of time to do that. I think we'll have maybe at least 3 class sessions we can spend on that. On the last Wednesday, we'll have a singing, as we typically do. So that's the 29th. So I think everything's moving along pretty well, and we're getting this very important book covered. I asked Wally to lead us in a word of prayer, so we'll bow. Thanks. All right. As we've pointed out, I think several times, the first step in understanding a text is to understand what was being said to the original audience. And if we don't do that, then we have no control. We could kind of make it say whatever we want it to say. And this particular text talks about the master-servant relationship or master-slave relationship. And of course, when we hear that word slave, here they use the word bondservant, and we'll get into that in a little more detail in a minute. But when we hear that word slave or slavery, we naturally think of our American experience and the culture and all that. So I want to spend a little time before we jump into the text in a bit. I want to spend a little time talking about that, because that, if we don't, then that's kind of the elephant in the room. You know, why didn't Paul address slavery directly, or did he? And so we're going to spend a little time doing that before we get into the text itself. I don't think the text itself is too difficult to understand. Now, when we're making application of that, you know, there's various ways, because nobody in here that I know of is a bond servant in the way that they were back these days. So we need to, if we can, see if we can stretch that a little bit to cover. And you have to be careful with doing that, of course. But we'll see. First thing I want to do, though, is I want to read some of the companion texts. Some of the texts that talk about the same subject. I'll read this one first in Ephesians chapter 6, starting at verse 5. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by way of eye service, as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will, as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he's a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. Okay, turn over to Colossians chapter 3, verse 22. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. you're serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you have a master in heaven. Very much the same, very parallel with some additional information there. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Verse 1. Let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. And then in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18, he simply says, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. So what I wanted to do first, and you kind of keep those passages in mind when we get back to the text itself, which I hope to do very soon, but I wanted to kind of cover these words that we encounter in this text and in all of these texts. The key word here, the key Greek word is doulos, which is translated various ways depending on the context. Sometimes it's translated bondservant, and that it says is often best described as a bondservant. That I probably shouldn't have put that in there that way. In fact, I took some of this information from the preface of the ESV version, so it may not be the best way to. I don't think that Greek word, if you happen to know what the Greek word is, that's always the best way to translate it. But it often is translated that way. And a bondservant was bound under contract to serve his master for 7 years in New Testament times. In the Roman, if you're a bondservant to an emperor, then it was 14 years. So you're bound for 14 years. But when the contract expired, the person was set free. That's something very different than what we understand about, obviously, 19th century slavery. It's not the same. Where absolute ownership by a master is meant, as used in Romans 6:20-23, the term slave is used, or should be, in the text, when that's the context. Now, it's used figuratively, of course, because there he talks about being a slave to sin and a slave to righteousness. And we'll look at that text later on if we get to that. But that corresponds more to slavery in the American sense, the way we think of it, because it's absolute ownership of another person. You have all rights over that person. And, of course, I won't keep you in suspense. Who has absolute rights over us? God, of course. So we are slaves. And John MacArthur, by the way, wrote a book which is entitled Slave, in which he makes the point that many of the translations, if not most of them, translate doulos inaccurately because they don't use the word slave. They use the word servant or bondservant. And I think he makes a very good point. Because we are absolutely beholden to Christ. He is our master, and we are his slave. Now, obviously, he's a gracious master and all of that. Now, I think we'll get to that a little bit more later. Where a more limited form of servitude is in view, bondservant is used, as in 1 Corinthians 7:21-24. And you look that up if you want to. But I think we understand that because we already looked at bondservant up above. And so, where it's not absolute mastery over the person, where they have some freedom. And then the next one there is where the context indicates a wide range of freedom, like when you every once in a while you see somebody's servant come up to Jesus and say something on behalf of the master, where they obviously have the freedom to move, and they're probably more like we think of servants, maybe Downton Abbey or something, I don't know. But you've got a servant who's somebody who's probably maybe certainly taken care of financially in some way. So you have that kind of thing. So you have that word is used in a wide number of ways, and we have to, like everything else, we have to have the context decide what that is, or help us decide what that is. But the question comes up, and it's kind of an apologetics question. I'm going to deal with it. I think we can deal with it pretty quickly. Why didn't Paul address the issue of slavery directly? Because some of the people, obviously, in New Testament times were slaves in the sense that we think of that, the sense of American slavery. They had no freedom to move about and all that kind of thing. So why didn't he do that? Okay, and he uses that, as we've already mentioned several places, he uses that analogy, if you will, to describe our relationship to Christ. It's not the only analogy, obviously. We're children. We're a bunch of them, but he does use that as well. Anything? Yes, Janet? Yeah, he's dealing with things as they are. You're not trying to social engineer and do that, because no matter what he would say along that line, that would not necessarily change the fact that there's some kind of slavery going on here. Jeff? Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's speaking from prison in Philippians 4, and he wasn't saying, well, he wasn't claiming I'm unjustly imprisoned, so we need to change that system, because that wasn't his argument. He said, be content. Who had? I forget. I'm out of order here, but I don't know. Go ahead, Jerry, and then do you have anything? Okay, go ahead, Jerry.